Division increases in a world that is meant to be whole and unified. So what do we do with that? We're going to look at James chapter 4 this morning, and I think there's some beautiful stuff here for us. Some challenging stuff, but beautiful nonetheless. James chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. According to a Santa Cruz city climate plan, more than 70 Santa Cruz buildings are expected to be at risk from flooding within 12 years with 4 inches of sea level rise. By the year 2100, this grows to 390 residential and 65 commercial properties along the 7 miles of Santa Cruz's coast. It comes with high rates of beach and coastal bluff retreat, the document states. And that's something that I think most people are aware of throughout the California coast, that there is coastal erosion in ways that really threaten our coastal living the way that we know it. And Monterey, down here on the southern end of Monterey Bay, the Monterey Peninsula, right? We're not free of the danger of coastal erosion, but we're not experiencing something as dramatic as Santa Cruz. And part of that is the sort of underlying, a lot of the underlying bedrock that we live our lives on is granite. And granite is this igneous rock. It's created with the warming and the cooling of magma. In Santa Cruz, a lot of the bedrock in Santa Cruz is limestone, which is a sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rock is the accumulation or the deposition of mineral or organic particles. In other words, granite is a solid, hard rock, and limestone is less stable. In a world with growing division and uncertainty and structural and systemic turmoil, how do we stand firm in a world that is increasingly tumultuous? How do we find stability in all of this? Where do we find a firm footing when we see cracks in the ground of society turn into chasms that separate us? And they separate even the strongest of relationships. The simple answer, and if you want to turn off now, the simple answer is this: live out the gospel of Jesus. So if you needed sort of the short version, there it is. Blessings on your day. If you want to unpack that a bit, I think we can jump into James 4 and see how this text invites us to live out the words of Jesus by bringing about peace or shalom. James, in this book, is addressing believers scattered throughout the ancient world. In many ways, it's kind of like a summarizing view of what it means to be a follower of Christ. There's a bunch of different little lessons in this short book. And it's a stark reminder that a spirituality representing the Lord Jesus Christ is one that's meant to be lived out in our daily living. It's so easy to keep spirituality in the abstract, ether of the cosmos somewhere. But James is a book that says, no, the ways of Jesus have to be embodied in our daily rhythms, our daily living. And he's bridging the gap between an abstract spirituality in the ether somewhere into the ethics of daily life. Dr. Marie Isaac says it's very reminiscent of Jewish wisdom literature that we find in like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. And James, the book is in many ways just saying like a nominal faith, a faith that just says, yay Jesus. It's not reflective of Christ's will. It's not reflective of what God longs for us. And that we're called to demonstrate our submission to the lordship of Christ by how we live our lives, fueled by his grace and shaped by his wisdom. In other words, a faith in God that does not transform our daily living is not a faith shaped by Jesus. Earlier in the book of James, there's a very famous passage in the first chapter in verse 22 which says, don't just be hearers of the word, but be doers of the word. And the word there that's used for the word, where it says be doers of the word, is this logos, this reason, this logic, this logos. And you know, if you incorporate the broader biblical witness, the Gospel of John, it opens with this declaration that this logos, this word, became flesh, and that is who Jesus is. Jesus is the perfect embodiment of the word, of this logos. And in many ways, what James is acknowledging is that, you know, it doesn't work to have faith apart from works. A faith that sort of dismisses any kind of call to action is not a faith that it's consistent with the way of Jesus and the person of Jesus. And he continues in verse 2, he says, look, you believe that God is one. In other words, you believe the right things. Fantastic. He says, you do well. He says, even the demons believe and they shudder, right? To simply believe Jesus is who he is, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one, to simply believe that doesn't really do anything. We're called to live a life that reflects a submission to the lordship of that God. And here James is saying, we're called to bring life to those words. We're called to do those words, to live out the words of Jesus, right? And here word, it's easy for us to read, be doers of the word, and think that it's just referencing to scripture here. But really James, whose many attribute James as the author, the brother of Jesus here, and what he's saying is, be doers of the word of Jesus. Take all the things that Jesus said and did and do those things. And we bring to life the words of Jesus, calling us to compassion, to mercy, and love. That faith is this sort of combination of belief and action. And if you don't want to entertain the words of James here or Jacob in the Greek, and if that's challenging, we can always go back to the words of Jesus in Matthew 7, right, where Jesus goes through the great Sermon on the Mount and says all these powerful things, and there's this tendency to be like, well, those are kind of lofty, you know, I'm not sure you really mean for us to do those things. And then Jesus says, okay, by the way, as I close, everybody who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise builder who built a house on bedrock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the wind blew and beat against that house. It didn't fall because it was firmly set on bedrock. But everybody who hears these words of mine and doesn't put them into practice will be like a fool who built a house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the wind blew and beat against that house. It fell and was completely destroyed. It's kind of like building your house on sand. And I'm not going to call everyone who built a house in Santa Cruz a fool. But that's in some ways what Jesus is getting at, what James here is getting at, is if we relegate the words of Jesus to an abstract spirituality, we miss out on the ways in which Jesus is inviting us to live out a faith here and now in our daily living as peacemakers, as those who see a world increasingly divided and consider the ways that Jesus is inviting us to live out his words of compassion and love and truth and justice, and to live those out in a way that brings about a wholeness where there was a shattered shalom. Again, how do we do that? It's a simple living out the gospel. It's the good news, it's the kingdom, it's the words of Jesus. And what does that have to do with destroying division? It has lots to do, because later in the book of James, we have this, the words we read earlier, where James kind of sets the table and he says, be doers of the word, do the stuff. In the end of chapter 1, he says, be sure to care for orphans and widows. Like, that's the kind of spirituality, the religion that God honors and celebrates. And just because you believe that God is who he is, that doesn't mean anything. You need to have a life that reflects, allegiance to that God and to God's kingdom. And then he continues, and in verse 4, and he says, look, these conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? And the words there, the word translated polemos for conflict and make for disputes, both of these words have connotations of war. I think the danger is we read these texts, we read something like conflicts and disputes, and I put my individualistic sort of lens, and I read that like, okay, so James here is writing about, me and my buddy that are like, we're having a hard time like, connecting because we're in conflict and there's disputes among what I think and he thinks, and and maybe that's part of it, but here James is, there's something even broader and more substantial and weighty and significant. He says these sort of wars, these wars and earth-shattering conflicts and disputes, where do they come from? He continues, says, do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? And here, cravings, the word there in Greek is hedone, like, and it's where we in English get the term hedonism, right? So it's not just cravings like, man, I'm really hungry, like that is some, but it's cravings. It's cravings that have this sort of self-centered, this selfish tone. That it's not cravings that are natural and good and right and true. There are those things, but it's these like hedonistic, self-centered, selfish cravings that drive our actions, that lead to an outward expression of conflict and war and dispute. Continues, he says, so you want something, you do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. And then he says, look, and even when you do ask, you don't receive. You know why? Because you ask wrongly. You're asking to spend on what you get for your own pleasures. You're praying to God. You're asking for these things, but you're doing so in a way where you're allowing that deep internal hedonism, that selfish hedonism that's causing all these conflicts. You're letting that drive your desires and your actions, and it's leading to a divided world. And James is calling out this selfish hedonism as the root, as the cause of this conflict, this war, this division, this increasingly divided community. And if you unpack and if you get in the within you, right, or he says these cravings that are at war within you. The word there is melos, and it refers to like internal body parts deep within kind of a thing, and it's the same root that's used to refer to like a melody, right? A melody of a song. That there's this basically what James is talking about. There's these deep internal cravings that are so central to a part of who you are, like it's like deep within your body. It's a part of who you are, and perhaps another way to think of it is that it's like the deep song that your soul is singing. James is calling out this selfish hedonism that's deep within us. It's this cause of conflict and wars. And it raises the question, is our life singing a song of selfish desire that leads to conflict? Is your life singing a song of selfish desire leading to conflict? And the challenge here is that we don't always know what's deep down within us, right? And there's a reason psychology exists. We need help unpacking the depths of our soul and of our heart. We don't always know what's deep down in there. I mean, this is why Jesus talks about uncleanliness, right, coming from within, where he's getting so upset with people that are so worried about ceremonial, laws and food law. What can they eat? And now he says, don't you understand? Everything goes into the mouth and the stomach. It goes through the body and then it's gone. He says, but what contaminates a person in God's sight, it's something that's out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, sexual sins, thefts, false testimonies, and insults. He says, out of all that stuff, it's inside that kind of comes out. These contaminate a person in God's sight. And we all know stories of someone who goes to a doctor for a routine checkup and only to see that, you know, the doctor somehow discovers like advanced stages of cancer, or discovers some kind of like disease or illness that they had no idea was there. I think it's just the reality that we're all broken in some ways, and especially with something like this sort of deep, embedded, internal song of selfishness that's driving our actions in a way that's contributing to division and conflict. And as those feeling a call to be agents of peacemaking in this world, we have to be willing to do the hard internal work and look at our own deep desires that contribute to that. There's this invitation to do that deep internal work, to consider how we are making division instead of making peace. And here James is making these similar points. He's saying these external symptoms of division, he says, look at all those things. What can they be traced back to? They're traced back to an internal, deep selfishness within you. Take time to explore the deepest parts of who you are. Listen to the melody of your soul. Is it a song of selflessness or one of selfishness? You know, earlier we spent time to take time in prayer and consider the ways that we can give generously and enter into the discipline of generosity. And as a church, we receive an offering in order to move forward. And in some sense, this is one reason why we enter into that discipline of generosity. Because this sort of internal, deepest corners of our soul sometimes sing a song of selfishness and we don't even know it. We take a step back and we realize, wow, like my time, my money, the resources that I'm blessed with, if I don't stop and intentionally move toward generosity, intentionally move toward ways that I can use those resources beyond myself, there's a tendency to use all of that for me. That's a dangerous thing. And so that's one reason why we value this discipline of generosity. So what does it look like, though? What is the deep, internal work of exploring our own, songs of selfishness deep within? What are the desires that fuel our conflicts or our polemics? The things that fan the flames of our disputes and our wars, the internal melodies deep within that shatter the shalom of this world. I've noticed a few in me as I've been putting this message together. Some of the deep desires within me that have led to broken peace or shattered shalom, and here's a few that I've noticed in me, and this is like just within the context of Facebook, right? I mean, what greater expression of shattered shalom in this world than our Facebook feeds, but really, I mean, something that I've really tried to sit with and say, okay, what are some of the songs of selfishness that drive my actions, that contribute toward division? And there's three that, the top three of an infinite number I'll share with you this morning. And I think the first sort of song of selfishness that I was able to identify is like a need to be right, needing to be right. I have this sort of false identity that I claim as the sort of defining factor of who I am, that I want to be seen as intelligent or informed or inspired. And sometimes, this may come as a shock to you, sometimes I am wrong. And as hard as that may be, the acceptance that I am wrong, it's not something I'm willing to embrace. And when I refuse to allow that to take place, when I need to cling on to this desire to be right, even in the midst of a situation when I'm wrong, what does that do? It leads to a sort of stubbornness that refuses to acknowledge, I was wrong here. How can I move forward in a way that embodies truth and humility? And let's move forward together. Now, don't get me wrong. This does not mean that I don't speak out for truth as I understand it with as much eloquence and wisdom as I can muster. I definitely do that. But when I realize that my need to be right can move me toward places of greater conflict and an unhealthy division, I need to keep that song of selfishness in check. Another song that I think that I need to be aware of is desiring comfort. Don't tell me that I'm wrong or that my worldview or the paradigms of this world that have yielded a place of comfort for me are somehow flawed. Because if that really is true, then it will disrupt my life in a way that forces me to make changes. And I don't want to make changes because things are pretty comfortable. And yet, at the same time, I stop and praise and sing to and pray to and submit my life to the lordship of Jesus, who is the one who comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable. And sometimes, if I'm willing to allow it, truth will disrupt my comfort. And so when I hear the distant echoes of the song of selfishness within, of me desiring comfort, I need to be willing to put that in check and say, sometimes my comfort needs to be set aside for the sake of embracing truth in a way that helps us move toward shalom and away from division. And it doesn't mean that I can never find rest or comfort, or that, but it's acknowledging that sometimes truth disrupts my comfort. I think a third song is this sort of clinging to a shared identity. And I'm guilty of this, and I know, I think a lot of us maybe can relate to this one, this idea that we have shared identities, whether it's a political party you're a part of, it's a national identity as a citizen of whatever country. Maybe it's a theological identity a theological shared identity of, maybe not just Christian, but, pick a denomination. For us, it's the covenant, maybe Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopal, we've all got sort of a shared identity, and some of us have multiple. And the danger comes when I cling to this shared identity at the expense of truth. And I cling to a shared identity in ways that dismiss truth, that challenges that broader community that has a shared identity with me. Am I willing to let truth disrupt who I understand myself to be within a broader context of community, whatever that might be? And this doesn't mean we can never identify ourselves with others, but it does mean that we have to be willing to allow truth to disrupt our shared identity with others. Whether it's a political party or a theological tradition or whatever, or a nation state, we have to be willing to let truth disrupt that. So these are some of my songs of selfishness. I hope you've enjoyed them. They lead to, and I think the reality is when I let those songs drive and shape and dictate my actions, they lead to conflict, they lead to war, dispute, and they contribute to the division in this world. They perpetrate increasing divisiveness, and they participate in the shattering of shalom, of wholeness, of peace, of unity. They contribute to a shattering of that. When I need to be right, when I desire comfort, when I cling to a shared identity in unhealthy ways. Because when I let my selfish song of needing to be right drive my actions, what am I doing? I communicate in a way that attacks, it's absent of grace, it's creatively argues my point whether I'm right or not. When I let my selfish song of desire, comfort, or song of desire for comfort drive my actions, I ignore a challenging truth that sheds light on ways neighbors and brothers and sisters of mine are being subjected to injustice at the expense of my comfort. When I let my selfish song of clinging to a shared identity drive my actions, what am I doing? I'm placing the values of a community over and above the truth that challenges those values, and challenges them, and invites corrective action for the sake of those outside of that community. So here's the application. Here's the question for you. What is the war within you? What are the wars? What are the songs of selfishness in your soul that lead to outward symptoms of shattered shalom? How does a deep internal hedonism contribute to an increasingly divided world? How might we submit these songs of selfishness to the lordship of the Prince of Peace? Remember, they're so connected, right? Our internal songs of selfishness lead to external expressions of shattered shalom. And there's an invitation that James presents to us in chapter 4 here to do the hard work of internal exploration, to prayerfully ask God to guide us in that effort, to listen to the gentle whisper of our Creator, longing to bring about renewal in our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength. Because our renewal and your renewal, it leads to the renewal of this world. And this is why our prayer is continuously, God, renew us so we might renew the world with you. This inner transformation by God's grace is what leads to structural renewal in this world by God's grace. So, what are your songs of selfishness? What are your deep internal, deep within, soul-filled songs of selfishness? Temptation here, of course, and if you're like me, you're doing this. The temptation here is to start thinking about everyone else's songs of selfishness that cause them to shatter shalom, right? So pick whatever political party you're a part of. If you're like me, you've already listed out 3 or 4 of that party's songs of selfishness, right? But that's the temptation. That is the temptation, to sit and assume that all the problem is over there. And I'm not saying that that side doesn't have problems. Of course they do, whatever side it is. But the invitation is to first evaluate our own songs of selfishness, not the songs of others. To evaluate our own desires that contribute to conflict and disputes, not the desires of others. Because to enter into peacemaking is to begin with acknowledging and owning and confessing our participation in shattered shalom. Once we do the hard work of that, of facing our inner selfish cravings and desires and passions, when we evaluate and identify those selfish songs within that lead to the symptoms and demonstrate and perpetuate shattered shalom, once we do that hard work, then we can start speaking truth in love to our neighbors. Again, if you don't take my word for it, take Jesus's in Matthew 7, where he says, look, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Once we do that hard work as peacemakers, as those willing to own the ways that we're contributing to division, once we've removed that log from our eye by God's grace and in the fellowship of other believers who can help us see what that log looks like, then and only then can we see clearly enough to take the speck out of our neighbor's eye. And that is what we're called to as peacemakers. That is peacemaking. It's owning our contributions to conflict, it's naming them, it's repenting from them, it's moving toward healing alongside others. That is peacemaking. It is not peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is something entirely different altogether, right? Peacemaking leans into the brokenness. It leans into it and acknowledges that there is work to do on all sides. And I love how Dr. Dennis Edwards kind of summarizes this desire to move toward peace, to move toward wholeness and restoration. And he writes simply, he says, the corrective for conflict is love. But love does not mean ignoring evil or minimizing injustice. Love puts a spotlight on injustice. Love puts a spotlight on injustice. May God's love put a spotlight on your internal songs of selfishness. May love expose our internal songs of selfishness and help us confront injustice in our own lives so that we can confront it in the world of which we are a part. That love has to include honesty with ourselves and others. And of course, conflict is the context. Conflict is the context. It's the theme in which one of the most famous passages in all of Scripture about love was written. It's in 1 Corinthians 13. That, I mean, if you've ever been to a wedding, you've heard this read, and it's read within this sort of romantic ideal of marriage, and it's great, and it applies to marriage for sure. And at the same time, when Paul was writing this to the church in Corinth, he was writing, admonishing them and saying, look, you're in conflict, you're separated from one another, you're not living shalom, you're not living in a way that's united and bearing witness to a loving and sort of together kind of community, living out God's kingdom here on earth. You're divided, there's division, there's loss. And he says, no, you're like a body, everyone needs one another. And then he says, like consider, the sort of driving force behind that is love. And he says, let me explain what love looks like. And so read this passage again, maybe with new eyes entirely, that help us to see the ways that love is really the driving force behind this invitation to consider ways that we're participating in conflict. And that love is the fuel. Love is the corrective for conflict. Because Paul says, look, love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Are we willing to let this vision of love dismantle our inner songs of selfishness that go around shattering shalom? As Edwards says, love is the corrective for conflict. Patient love, kind love, humble love, forgiving love, truthful love, hopeful love, enduring love, never-ending love. May love be the corrective for your conflicts. May love include an honesty that recognizes your participation and contribution to those conflicts. May you do the hard work of listening to those inner selfish songs of desire deep within. May you learn to see what those are, keep them where they belong as you move toward a love that offers unity, that offers peace, that drives us as agents of peacemaking into this world to bring about shalom in a world with shattered shalom. May it be so.